This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. This week, exploring the symbols we make, the symbols we wear, and the symbols we use to guide our lives. Of the more than 100 books read and authors interviewed for Up Close this year, certainly one that did more to surprise and shift my perspective is one we'll be looking at in this episode. How do symbols and restrictions, including those that are part of the Jewish tradition, free us to live better lives? I talk with Cornell University professor Tracy McNulty, author of Wrestling with the Angel, Experiments in the Symbolic Life. But before we get into the philosophy of symbols, we'll look at two more popular examples of symbols, tattoos and fashion. The fashion revolution of the 1990s is examined by New York Post reporter Maureen Callahan in Champagne Supernovas, Kate Moss, Marc Jacobs, Alexander McQueen, and the 90s renegades who remade fashion. And while clothes have been the standard for millennia, tattoos seem to be a new normal. BuzzFeed Books editor Isaac Fitzgerald and graphic journalist Wendy McNaughton talk about their collaboration, Pen and Ink, Tattoos, and the stories behind them. Those last two brought the most positive energy to any interview we've done in studio this year. And so we'll start with them, Isaac Fitzgerald and Wendy McNaughton. This book is basically a series of profiles of tattoos to a degree of the people in them. First-person narratives paired with certain tattoos. And you go through the tattoos, and some of them have some really interesting stories behind them. Some of them have less interesting stories behind them. Yeah. What was the most interesting one for you?
One that really stands out to me is Mona.
Mona Al-Tahawi.
Yeah.
She's a pretty famous speaker and writer on human rights. And
her story is just so incredibly difficult and compelling, but it's also a story of like rising up and how the tattoo was about taking control back of her body. And that one to me is just so meaningful.
And there's another story in there that's really powerful on a similar theme, Roxane Gay, the writer. She has two kind of tribal design tattoos on her arms that are quite beautiful, and she said that she got them, I think, to feel a sense of control and reclaiming and beauty in her body, something that she had struggled with, and that this was a way that she could do that for herself. And I think a lot of people actually have that experience with tattoos. It's a way of taking control of your body and making choices with it to show to the world.
This becomes a symbol that they visit and revisit over the course of their lives. And it can come to mean different things, and memories are fallible, memories change. And you get the sense for a lot of them that there's a great transformation going on in how they reflect upon this symbol, but at the same time, this symbol continues to have a permanence in a sense of meaning for them. How do you get the sense that people were dealing with that in the sense of growing older with it, growing past it, and at the same time taking it with them?
Well, I can speak just from my own personal experience. Yeah. I have entheos, a Greek word tattooed into my back when I used to study the classics. Let me tell you what I don't do anymore. Study the classics. I did not go on to become a scholar. I did not by any stretch of the imagination. But it reminds me of that moment, which really I would almost, those memories would probably be close to gone if it wasn't something that I knew was always there, because life is really long. And you live so many different lives in this life. And there's so many different times that you, as an individual, as a person, change. Yeah.
This tattoo, I think, that we could end up with, that this was a fascinating example to me of how you come to embody the symbols that you place on your person. Where this is, she's an editor in Scotland who felt like putting wings on herself so that she could fly, she could travel, she could go anywhere, and she was going to get them colored in at a later date. And then when she never really got anywhere, she never got them colored in, and so they were like this example of the, I guess, her blank itinerary, right?
That's nicely put. Yeah.
You know, and this idea that you can really, that these symbols, you know, does the symbol make the person? Does the person make the symbol? Does the constant revisiting of the symbol change? But how do people kind of become their tattoos?
It's an interesting point. I mean, like we were saying before, I guess that the mark itself remains the same, but who we are changes. And so its meaning to us changes as we look at it throughout life. And I guess that's what happened for her, and she made one decision and then has decided to leave it as it is now because it's more appropriate for who she is now. And that's pretty cool. They both changed together, which is rare, I guess.
Yeah, but it's like life just happens. Life happens to us, and it's all about what we're presenting to the world and also how the world takes us in.
Now, going from symbols permanently placed on the body to ones we take off and on, the fashion world of the 90s with Maureen Callahan. Well, it's a fascinating idea about what art was in the 90s, because in general it seems like if you go to a bunch of galleries, you'll find art from the 80s, you'll find art from the aughts, but a lot of what we think of as what goes on exhibit now from the 90s, it actually is fashion, right?
So much of what Gen X really did in the 90s, whether you're talking about high art or high fashion, high anything, was to democratize it all and say there's room for everyone. And, if you won't publish me, I'll start a zine. If you won't sign my band, I'll start a label. If you won't show my art, I'll go down to Ludlow Street. I'll go down to the Alleged Gallery and they'll show it. And it was just this constant press and push against mainstream culture. And it really was, I think, in the middle of the decade, that last moment where it didn't take very long for the alternative to become mainstream, and then for the mainstream to become big business.
One of the things that's interesting about Kate Moss as a figure throughout this era is that, on the one hand, she's supposed to represent an upheaval, that she's supposed to represent the idea of beauty as we've come to think of it as dead. But then very quickly she becomes what everyone describes as beautiful.
I talk about this in the book, how for every girl who looked at Kate Moss and said to themselves, oh, there's another way. There's a girl who looks a little bit more normal, a little bit more that body type I can relate to. There were other girls who felt just as oppressed by Kate as they did by the supermodels. They weren't super skinny, they weren't waifish, they didn't sort of have this sort of androgynous quality where clothes would just drape over them, that's no more Kate's fault than it is any other working model's fault. It's a larger part of sort of the fashion industrial complex,
In another realm of kind of moving past and moving into new ideas of things, you have this quote from Alexander McQueen, where he was saying, everybody wants. He says everybody wants, a certain kind of idea of fashion, but I think that what's beautiful is inside a person, which is kind of a hilarious statement for someone who's making clothes that go outside a person. But also this idea that all these people were kind of chasing after beauty, but also chasing after a notion of inner beauty and this democratizing of beauty. They were all living pretty bad lives.
Well, it's very interesting because each of them at some point either considered plastic surgery or had it. When Kate was starting out, she was so insecure, she thought she should get veneers for her teeth and get breast implants. And she was advised by people smart enough not to do it. The things that she regarded as imperfect and the things that photographers, some would vocally say, you're never gonna make it, you're not perfect enough. There were those around her who knew that those things would actually be her strengths and set her apart, and they were right. Marc Jacobs wound up gaining and losing weight throughout the decade, struggling mightily with drug and alcohol abuse. As he aged, he began to get plastic surgery. McQueen got liposuction, and he had his teeth capped. He had a wattle under his chin that he had removed. He dyed his hair. He had glamour shots taken, and he never lost the sense that people in the fashion industry were laughing behind his back, and that they regarded him as the fat East Ender who thought he was good enough for French couture. So, when McQueen says something like that, I'm sure there's a part of him that really wanted to believe it. But he, as Marc Jacobs was and is, as Kate Moss, as any of us is, just never completely secure in their presentation.
And finally, one of the most interesting books from this year, looking at the meaning of the symbolic life, discussed by author Tracy McNulty. There's a lot of discussion today in America in Judaism, about the idea that all these laws are really holding us back from where we could be, and we see it certainly in a lot of rhetoric, certainly within, like, say, the Tea Party in America here today, and in the Jewish world, we see a lot of discussion of the idea that these are old restrictions that are keeping us from really becoming the person we want to be.
Right. In the political context, we see all kinds of examples like that today, where the written law, the Constitution, is just sort of cast off as this hindrance to taking action, right? And a lot of people have talked about the ways in which that represents a kind of resurgence of executive sovereignty and the idea of a president or a leader, right, who's no longer limited. But it also interested me in that it expresses this sort of idea that, you know, for George Bush, democracy is something that is in our blood, right? It's something whose spirit we have internalized. And therefore, we no longer need the Constitution. We no longer need the laws.
There's a lot here about how this idea in the modern world that we're just supposed to be kind of cast free to do whatever we might choose,
right,
is kind of like, well, some early modern philosophers might refer to that as its own kind of enslavement to our impulses.
Right.
And then, but there's a lot within the idea of all these restrictions that we can find our better selves.
Yeah, so I was interested in the way in which, you know, we so often think about freedom as just freedom from restrictions, right? There's some external limitation on what I want to do, and the idea is to break from that. But in some ways, that's a very narrow idea of freedom. That's either impulsive, as you suggest, right, or one that's always situation specific, right? So my freedom is always defined solely in relation to some sort of external power that might be blocking me. So I was interested in other ways of thinking about struggling with constraints or with limits as itself enabling a more durable kind of freedom, a broader kind of freedom that's not always defined in relation to something else, right? And I think Mosaic law traditions in particular are one of the richest sources of thinking about that, but also one of the sources of this more cliched view you're talking about, right? Enslavement to the law, enslavement to practice, right? Inability to live in the modern world. And so I was interested in sort of going back to some of those traditions to, you know, think about what they might have to offer for thinking about the importance of the written law in particular today.
And one of the major thinkers that you bring up throughout the book is Sigmund Freud,
right,
who is not by the Jewish community necessarily touted in any great way,
right,
in large part because in his own field of, you know, in the world of psychology today, right, Freud is kind of, he's old hat, and,
right,
and it's assumed that a lot of what he had to say is not, you know, he was treating people who were of a particular type. He wasn't really coming up with a lot of universally applicable stuff.
Right.
But you talk about his Jewish theology,
right,
seems extremely applicable today.
Freud only specifically engaged with Judaism in a very limited number of contexts, and actually at the very end of his life. So when he fled Austria during the Anschluss, that's when he was writing Moses and Monotheism, which is sort of his major statement about the Mosaic Law. But he didn't really engage with that material until very late. So I mean, one of the points that I'm making is that Freud is not necessarily immersed in a thinking of Judaism, not at all. You know, he was raised in a secular household. He appeared to be not very aware of Judaism or Jewish law. But in a sense, he comes to the same insights through the practice of psychoanalysis in a way that I think clarifies a lot of what is at stake in Jewish law, traditionally understood, and vice versa. So I was interested in the kind of consonance between those, like not necessarily a way in which Jewish traditions might have directly inspired his reading of Moses, but how in the practice of psychoanalysis, in the practice of Jewish law, something similar is at stake.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish Channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLM Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.